This is Ask Joe number
174.
Hello and welcome. This is Joe Gilder from HomeStudioCorner.com, and this is the podcast, also known as Ask Joe, the Home Studio Corner podcast, or just that place where that guy with the kind of balding hair does things related to music. However, whatever you call it, I don't care. But I'm glad you're here. If you're watching live on the live stream, hi live stream. Glad you're here. Got a fun group over there. If you're listening on the podcast, you can't see me, but I am waving vigorously at you. And I'm glad that you're listening, whether you're mowing the grass, playing racquetball. I don't know. What do you do when you listen to a podcast? Let me know. And then if you are watching this on YouTube, you can see that I'm waving less vigorously, but still fairly vigorously to you as well. I love doing these. And the reason I do them, aside from last week or the last episode, which was me making phone calls, which was weird, and you have to just go watch it to see what I'm talking about. Other than that, I normally get on here to talk about music and audio and answer your questions. And that's what I want to do today. So if you are here on the live stream, post your questions. I will see them and I will answer them, as many as I possibly can. But first, want to talk a little bit about something that is near and dear to my heart, but also something I don't like to talk about a lot. And it comes on the heels of this past weekend. Graham Cochran and I, if you don't know who Graham Cochran is, look him up. Your eyes will thank you. He is just handsome. But he is a good friend of mine. He runs a similar website to Home Studio Corner called The Recording Revolution, which if you know about Home Studio Corner and you don't know about that, something's wrong with you. Something messed up on the internet, because usually people hear about him first and then eventually make their way to me. Either way, Graham was here in town. We do something together called Dueling Mixes, where it's a monthly membership where we each mix a song, and the members can mix the song. They can see how Graham mixed it. They can see how I mixed it and compare them. And we did a meetup for members here in Nashville. So Graham flew his skinny butt up from Tampa, and we hung out here. We did a podcast, which is coming out soon, Simply Recording Podcast, which is another podcast that I do. And when we just hung out and had a lot of fun, and it was great. So after all of that, I tend to be, this may come as a shock to you, probably not. I'm a bit of an introvert. I like to be in my man cave alone. Ironically, I like to talk to you from a computer because you're way over there and it's safe. But people, a lot of times, scare me. Not scare is a little strong word. I can be uncomfortable around people. There's that insecurity we all have, which we all haven't. But there's a tendency for me to isolate and to do things in isolation to the point where maybe I haven't talked to a friend in a couple days or a couple weeks or a couple months. And it's just generally just not great for me. I tend to be a worse version of myself when I'm doing that. And the reason is, and here's the big theme of today, we all need people. Okay? I'm going to write that down because that's the name of this episode. We all need people. And now that may, you may want to cue, maybe I could put a backing track of We Are the World right here. You might think that sounds a little cheesy or whatever, but I don't care if you think it's cheesy because it's the truth. And honestly, reality is you are probably way ahead of the scale than me, because I tend to forget that a lot. You might know that and get that, and this might be a moment, so you can fast forward about 7 minutes and get to the Q&A section. But for the rest of us who tend to forget things that are important, we need people. And so it's especially difficult for us home studio folks. Whether you do this for a living and you're in your home studio for countless hours every week, or perhaps if you do it when you can. You have a regular day job, you have a business you run, and you also make time to be in the studio. Whatever your amount of time in the studio is, it can be a lonely, kind of isolating experience. And some of that's just necessary. Sometimes you just got to be in the studio, pull up a mix, and go to town, right? And you're just in the zone, and you're oblivious to the world. You're having fun. You're making, hopefully, an amazing mix, and that's that. But in bigger picture, I'm not talking about the need. I'm not going to go off on the need for a relationship and community and intimacy and all that stuff. That's important, and we can talk about that another day if you want. And that's kind of the the original thought that led me to talk about this. But more than that, I want to talk about how important it is to have other people involved in the music you're making. Not critical. Yes, there's a band called Self. It's a guy from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I honestly don't know. I knew of him about 10 years ago. But he came up this weekend at the Dueling Mixes meetup event, and his kind of claim to fame, especially early on at least, I don't know what he's doing now, but was he would record these albums where he would play everything. And, you've heard me talk about, Foo Fighters. The original first Foo Fighters record was all Dave Grohl on everything. And it's great. But you'll notice that, you may or may not have ever heard of Self. Just not a huge household name. And then Dave Grohl did not continue in that one-man band thing. He put a band together, even though he could argue maybe he could play that drum riff better than Taylor Hawkins, or maybe he could play that rhythm line just as well as Pat Smear, but he has them all in the band, and they all play their parts. And to me, that's just ridiculously important. Yes, of course, it would be boring to watch Dave Grohl stand there and sing and play guitar along to backing tracks. But more than that, I think they do better work when there are a bunch of musicians in a room versus one guy doing it one-on-one or one thing at a time. So that's kind of what I was thinking. And what got me thinking about this, I was hanging out with Graham this weekend, and just before he came down, he put up a video. If you haven't checked it out, go over to the Recording Revolution's YouTube page and try to find, I'll see if I can link to it below if I don't forget, but he did a longer video, and I forget what the name of it was, but essentially the gist was, if your mixes suck, it had the word suck in the title, I remember that, there's a good chance your mixes suck because you kind of suck as a musician and a songwriter. And so the recordings and the songs and the performances and the recordings all suck. So there's really no hope for the mix sounding good. And I think, and his point was not to just be a jerk and say that. His point was we need to have that self-awareness that we just might not be good at certain things. And it might be worth the trouble and the confusion and the even awkwardness of finding other people to work with to fill in the areas where we're weak, right? I don't know. That's hit me recently. And that's kind of been my story. When I did the album Out of Indiana, I did everything but bass, including programming the drums, and they were okay. But then on the next one I used a few more musicians, and then a few more, and then Better This Way, the full album, we tracked drums, bass, guitar, and keys, or some guitar, some keys, whatever I was playing, in my studio at the same time, and it was a completely different experience, and that whole album was a fun, different experience. So it's more about just experiencing fun things with other people, because making music should be fun. Yes, you want to release it to the world and have everyone enjoy it, but wouldn't it be great if you enjoyed the experience with people beforehand? So something to think about. Like I said before, you might think this is completely obvious and you get that, but I don't get that a lot of the time. I think it would just be better if I did it myself. Because, if I want to release an album, honestly, it would be really easy to just grab one of these acoustic guitars, write some songs, set up a mic, and play them. And maybe add in a little percussion and maybe play some keys and just do it all myself. And there's nothing wrong with that, but to play with a band, for me, is such a better experience. And the end result becomes much better because, it forces me to prepare better, that these songs are worthy of the time and money I'm going to invest in bringing in musicians and friends to come play. But then there's also the element of it just, oh dear, I just broke the Studio One thing. This is what happens when I try to move the audio around while I'm talking. But the other thing is it takes more effort, to schedule the session, to put the charts together. If I know the song in my head, I don't have to write charts for it, right? But if I'm bringing in musicians, I've got to really know the arrangement and write it down. So anyway, that's the little rant that I wanted to make today. I hope it hit home for you. If it did, leave a comment and let me know. Gotta go. Boom. Okay, I know I said I gotta go. I didn't mean I gotta go. I mean it's time to go answer your questions. So, here we go. I'm going to default to the people in the chat first because you guys are super sweet and nice. And I want to answer your questions first. So, first up, Alan says, when you're doubling guitars, what is the difference between the two takes? Do you change guitars, cab, amp, or everything? That's a great question. It really depends. If I'm going for, sometimes double means just complete double. I just literally create a new track, hit record, and do the same thing again. And sometimes that can be great. That goes with a big ol' asterisk because it depends. And I know those answers are lame, but it depends on the part. So for example, you mentioned in the terms of electric guitar, and this applies, but I'm thinking of a specific example of doubling acoustic where the exact double didn't feel super great. So if you're ever playing something with a lot of open strings, so something in kind of in the key of E where you're playing a lot of open strings, or something in open tuning like Dadgad, when you play that, there's a lot of the same notes ringing out. And when you double that, you tend to get the subtle differences in the tuning, because you play the song once, you play it again, your guitar is slightly out of tune just naturally. It's not a bad thing, it doesn't sound bad, but it can cause this weird kind of phasing sound. Even though it's two separate takes, there's so many similar notes ringing at the same time, they interact in a weird way. Now, I don't know what's technically happening when that happens, but I know to my ears it sounds thin, and it tends to take away from what I was going for. So in those instances, I will attempt to double, and if I hear that and I say, oh, that's not working, I'll double it differently. And for me, differently usually means playing a different part. So, for example, if it was a Dadgad song, which, by the way, if you've never experienced playing Dadgad tuning, which is tuning your guitar from low to high, D-A-D, G-A-D, big open D chord, if you've never done that on electric guitar through a big distorted sound, it's awesome. But either way, if you've got one that they're not playing together nicely doubled, it's either not interesting enough or it kind of starts to sound so similar that it feels a little mono. In that case, I would play a different part. So if it was the Dadgad thing, one guitar is tuned to open tuning, I'd play it again with a guitar not tuned to that. I used to be very much of the mindset of, if I did this take on the neck pickup of a Les Paul, then the double has to be on the bridge pickup of a Tele. Could not be more opposite in tone. And honestly, when I do that, some of the time I end up fighting that in the mix, because one is so beefy and thick and one is so thin and bright that they don't really balance each other very well. So I'm having to compensate for each to make it sound cohesive. So in a lot of times, I'm just playing different parts that complement each other. Sometimes I am doubling the same thing. It depends on the genre of music. If it's just a big rock song, sometimes just playing the same part twice on the exact same settings is great. Sometimes changing the amp is great. Changing the amp sound if you're using an amp emulator, changing the guitar. These are all certainly doable, but ultimately it's going to come down to what sounds right for that particular song. I've done it all the different ways, and each one has been dictated by just how it sounded. No real formula other than I know if one's got a lot of big open strings and I do that again, my experience tells me that doesn't work as well as, I've done before where the song's in E and there's a lot of big open strings, and I've actually capoed an electric guitar. Something like capoed it on, no, I'm thinking of a song that was in A, and I had several guitars playing just a normal A kind of power chord thing, and I needed two big doubled guitars to kind of fill out the chorus. It's for the song Better This Way. If you go to joegildermusic.com, listen to Better This Way. When you get to the chorus, there's these big it's a Les Paul through a Marshall sound coming out of left and right, and they're playing the exact same thing. In those, the song was in A, and I've been playing a lot of stuff kind of up here on the neck with like a Tele, and then some other stuff down playing in maybe like an A power chord, but it just didn't ring out the way I wanted it to. So I put a capo on the electric guitar on the second fret and played it in G, and those open G chords sounded fantastic with the Les Paul into a Marshall style amp model. And did that, sounded so good, did it again, just doubled it, panned them left and right, it sounded amazing, and I kept it. So is that ideal? Not always, but especially for recording, there's no rules, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Speaking of guitars, the Jeb Dude says, what would you suggest for a head, cabinet amp, or a combo? Man, there are a million suggestions, you know what I mean? It depends on what style of music you like. If you like clean tones, if you like broken up tones. For me, my latest amp purchase was a Fender, one of their new 68 Custom Silverface Deluxe Reverbs. Really cool amp. It breaks up pretty well, but you can also just leave it clean. and it takes pedals well. I think I'm a Fender amp guy, at least currently, and I've never owned one. I've always liked the models in my 11 rack that you can see over my shoulder over there. Really like the Fender tones there, so kind of that's what drove me in that direction, but really depends on the style of music. Honestly, a big way to answer that is, what do your favorite artists play? The ones that you love their guitar tone, that's probably the style of amp you probably should get to, because for whatever reason, it resonates with you and you like it. That's the biggest reason I can give. Jeb Dude says, what's your favorite genre of music? Pretty much anything rock. Anything from more alternative, almost folk rock, to relatively heavy stuff. I don't get into metal too much, but I like to get it pretty heavy. So yeah, that's pretty much me. Camilo says, can you explain phase? I'm new to this, and I understand it happens when you have two microphones facing each other, but how do you avoid or correct that? Well, there's an article I wrote that you should check out. It's called What is Phase? So just go search for the word phase on homestudiocorner.com. Scroll down to the bottom, there's a search bar, and you'll see that article. You should read that. It'll explain it more concisely than I can here. But all phase is talking about is the time relationship between two signals. So if I take my voice and I delay it a little bit, I'm going to do an experiment here. I didn't plan to do this, but if you have my voice and then you have another copy of this voice that's delayed a little bit, it's going to sound weird. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit a button in my DAW that's going to bring my voice through the system, and you're going to hear it sound kind of delayed. Let's see, can you hear that? That might just sound like a slapback delay, so it's a bad example. But anyway, if something's delayed by a few milliseconds, it starts to sound phasey, which starts to have this thin sort of sound to it. If you're a guitar player, or if you know the sound of a phaser pedal or a chorus pedal or a flanger pedal, they all have different ways of manipulating. Some are manipulating pitch, but they're also manipulating the phase relationship. They take the guitar signal, they copy it, and then they delay it a little bit, or they change the amount of delay between the two signals, so there's this weird, that's all done through like phase relationship stuff. So that's what phase is. Now, a typical example of polarity, which polarity and phase are interchanged, the words are, although they don't mean the same thing. Phase has to do with time relationships. Polarity has to do with which direction the waveform is going. So if you have a microphone on top and bottom of your snare, then the sound, when the stick hits the snare, that wave is going to be pushing downward, right? So that means the top mic is going to see a concave sort of wave, right? Because the wave is actually moving away, and the bottom mic is going to see a convex wave. So the two together are going to be recording out of phase, out of polarity signals. So that's why typically when you're recording, you take the bottom mic and you flip the polarity so it matches the top. The result is that it tends to sound full versus thin when it's out of phase. Now, when you're using two microphones on a source, I don't use stereo mics very much at all. When I do, it's almost always having them right next to each other in like an XY pattern, because that's the best way to prevent any phase issues. People use wide space microphones to give a nice wide sound. And the way you get that wide sound is because you get the signal is hitting, the sound is hitting the right microphone sooner than it's hitting the left. And so your ear hears that as it being off to the right. It gives it width. The problem is there's a lot more potential for there to be phase issues. If you record acoustic guitar really close with two microphones, more often than not, you're going to have some elements of the sound be out of phase. That's just been my experience. It's not always the case. But especially if you're miking it pretty close, some frequencies are going to be in phase and some aren't. And that can sound good. A lot of times it can sound thin and you'll find yourself wrestling with it. So for me, I use one microphone on really everything except for maybe piano, because it's just a big instrument and it takes two microphones at least to kind of capture that, or drum overheads where I want to have a little stereo spread. But usually drum overheads, I'm XY. I don't care if it's super wide. I really don't care. Does that mean the other ways are wrong? No, not at all. There you go. Somebody said, piggybacking off of the last question, what music are you listening to now? I was telling Graham when he was here, I got into a band called Biffy Clyro, Biffyclyro. They're this three-piece out of Scotland and just heavy as all get out. He plays strats sometimes to open tuning, and the bass player has these sick distorted tones, and the drummer's great, and they all sing too. Really cool band. They're heavier rock. They almost have a kind of a punk vibe to them. I don't know. I'm not good at genreizing things, but I like them. They've been really fun lately. Oh, Jason from California says, I'm a Pro Tools user who's thinking of switching to Studio One. Are there any features in Pro Tools that you missed after switching? I record live instruments mostly and some MIDI. If you're not doing much MIDI, to me it's a great switch. But at the same time, let me just say, unless you can give me a compelling reason why you need to switch, I say don't. The reason I switched, I was in a position where I was selling Studio One for a job, and I had to learn it. And then I just happened to I had to use it to learn it, kind of fell in love with it, started using it more and more. That was my experience. Now, if you switch, that's fine. I'm not going to be mad at you if you do. I mean, obviously, PreSonus is a sponsor. We've done stuff together. I like their stuff. I'm using it. It's right here in front of me. They didn't pay me to use Studio One. I really did just like it. But switching is a pain, and especially if you are doing this in your spare time and you have maybe a few hours a week to devote to audio, then switching DAWs is the worst thing you can do, because now you're going to spend all your time learning the new software, and when you're learning new software, you're not really making new music. And to me, the most important thing is that you're making and releasing music. So if getting a new DAW is going to make you do that, then I say don't. Now, if there's a feature that Studio One has and you absolutely must have that feature, and Pro Tools doesn't have it, or if there's things like, I don't even know. I know Pro Tools has a subscription version and things like that, or just whatever. If you just want to change, you just feel like changing, I don't think that's a great idea to change, because the learning curve will prevent you from making more music. I posted this in my VIP members, I think it was in the Facebook group the other day. Somebody emailed me with basically the same question, and in their question they had said, I haven't recorded much in Pro Tools, so it's not like I'll have a hard time having to transfer over a bunch of songs into Studio One. And I quoted what he said, and I said, hey, if this is true that you haven't recorded much in Pro Tools, absolutely do not change DAWs, because you haven't been doing any recording. You should have hundreds and hundreds of songs or something in your, I'm not saying you should, but clearly he wasn't doing a lot with Pro Tools, and so switching just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, I know you can make arguments for switching can be exciting and can kind of get you revved up creatively, and I get all that. But personally, I just think you're better off sticking with what you know and focusing on things like musicality. Now, Jason says the main reason for switching would be the MIDI to audio to MIDI capabilities. Pro Tools is costing me time in that department. Then maybe that's something to look at. I know Melodyne does that, and then you'd only have to learn Melodyne without having to learn a whole new DAW. And I will say I've not done the audio to MIDI and MIDI to audio features in Studio One. I hear they're cool. I've not done them, so I can't speak to that. So, yeah, I mean, that to me is a better reason than just, I'm bored. There are guys in Nashville on Pro Tools 6 and Pro Tools 8. Pro Tools 8 even is a 6-year-old software or something. You don't need the new stuff to do good music, which I know you all know that. A lot of folks. We got somebody waking up in Australia here, somebody in Serbia. Got a good crew out today. Thanks for hanging out with me. Let me go over to my Facebook page. I posted that I was going to have the Q&A, and a few questions came in there. And now the page is freezing, which is awesome. Let's go back to the chat. I think I answered all your questions. There was one early on. Nope. Okay, here's one. It's shameless self-promotion. Any recommendation compression tutorials you can recommend? Yes, I have one that is fantastic. I just redid it. It was 5 or 6 years old, and I redid it with all new information, all new videos. It is great. It's called Understanding Compression. You can check it out at understandingcompression.com. Total shameless self-promotion, but I've been getting emails from people who bought it recently, and it's kind of been an eye-opener for them. So definitely check that out. And if you're a VIP member, you can get it 30% off. What? That's awesome. Okay, so some questions from over at Facebook, which if you haven't connected with me there, facebook.com/Joe Gilder Music. And this one's from Ron. He says, another Studio One question. Tell me how to send all my tracks to 2-track so that I can do a stereo mix of my tracks. I'm sure this is easy, but I'm finding it confusing. You know what, Ron? That's not really a podcast question. Sorry. Basically, you just need to export. Like in Studio One, you click on File or go to Song. What is it called? Export Mix Down. It's the second option from the top, and that'll export your stereo mix. That's all you got to do. Now, if you're wanting to route it to different outputs, just take which is what your question said, go into Studio One, and over where your main output is, you just click on where mine says channel 1 plus 2, and just pick a different set of channels to output. Now, mine gives me 13 different options because I've got a big 24 channel mixer attached to it, but yours may only have a couple, and that's what you pick. Eric says, how often do you employ the mixing fast mentality and workflow? Always. Now, he's referring to, I've got a product called Speed Mixing that I did a sale on recently, where I mix a song in an hour, and which is a great exercise if you've never done it. Now, is the song done in the hour? No, of course not, but it's way more done than you might think, and it gets the essence of the song down pretty quick. So I tend to, it's just kind of the way I work now. I've conditioned myself to working pretty quickly and not wasting time, just because I don't want to get bored with the mix. So if I can get through various phases of the mix fairly quickly and keep it exciting, that's a win for everybody, including the client or whoever I'm mixing for. Good question. J. Robert Janes says, do you know of any way to get headphone cables and XLR leads to stop tangling together and getting caught on things? The best thing, and you may be too late for you, if you don't know how to wrap cables properly, how to properly coil them over under, Google it, YouTube it. I'm sure there's a video explaining it. I had one that I posted on my site, but it wasn't me, so I don't know if it's still there. But there's a proper way to do it that keeps them from tangling themselves. Also, getting those little cable ties. I've got one right here. Okay, so on this, I just unplugged a cable, and it is now stuck. I don't know if you can see this. If you're listening to the podcast, you can't. But it's a little 6-inch strip of Velcro. You can get them on Amazon for, I want to say I got a couple rolls of them for a few bucks. But they're just cable ties. And what input was that plugged into? 9, 10, what was that? This one? Anyway. And it stays on the cable, and you just wrap, once you coil the cable properly, you wrap it around, and it keeps it. But as far as headphone cords, I mean, a lot of it has to do with running them away from each other. So, you know, when we were here doing the podcast, I sat over here to my right, Graham sat over here, and I ran his headphone cable back behind the speaker, behind the desk, so that it was coming out over here and wasn't really, anyway, I don't know. I don't know if there's a better answer, but proper wrapping will keep them from being twisted themselves. If you just do the thing where you wrap it over your elbow, that cable's going to want to twist, and it will always be twisted. You really can't undo it, so hope that's not bad news for you. Somebody's wanting to switch to Logic. Dave is wanting to switch to Logic 10 or X, whatever they call it. Wants to know any good tutorials. I'm sure there are some. Folks, leave comments below and let him know. I don't know who they are. But rewind to the question about switching to Studio One. Unless you can give me a good reason why you want to switch, I would highly recommend perhaps considering not switching. Here's back in the... any good audiobooks recommendations? I have been not listening to audiobooks as much lately. Mainly because I feel like at some point I tend to read a lot of business books and listen to a lot of business audiobooks, and they can be a little overwhelming if you're just constantly getting ideas for things that you quote unquote should be doing. Yeah, so if you're looking for business audiobooks, I've got a page. If you go to, I think it's joelikes.com/Amazon. It's got a bunch of, I haven't updated it lately, but it's a bunch of more business books that I love. There's a little Amazon site with links to them all there. As far as audio related, The Go-Giver is fantastic. You should, is it an audiobook version or just the regular book version? It's a must read. It just kind of reminds you that we're in the giving business, no matter what business you're in. Super helpful. Jeb, dude, I see your question. I just don't. You want to know if there are any punk bands I'm into? The answer is no. I don't think so. back to the question about audiobooks. The Go-Giver. There's a great book called Here, There, and Everywhere by Jeff Emmerich, one of the guys who engineered a couple of the Beatles albums, including Revolver and I just blanked on the main one. The Sgt. Pepper, golly. Really cool. It's his kind of story of behind the scenes of what it was like to record the Beatles, which I'm not even a huge Beatles fan, but it was really interesting to listen to. And now here come all the comments of how can you not be a Beatles fan? Just leave me alone. And anything else? As a non-audio related, there's a book called Ready Player One. If you were into 80s pop culture references and video games from the 80s, it's a really fun fiction book that Spielberg is making a movie out of, which will be super cool. I don't know if I have any other questions here. If I don't, sometimes I have to leave questions out, but I think I've gotten to all of them. That is exciting. Let me check one more place. I think my VIP members might have a question or two for me. Let's just look over there and see, and if not, then we'll be done. Survey says the internet hates me. Okay. It's not loading up. And somebody in the forum was asking, is there any good places of music to visit in Nashville? Yeah, there are. Honestly, if you just Googled, you'll see a bajillion. The Nashville Scene is the local free magazine or free newspaper that'll tell you what's going on the days you're here. Otherwise, you walk in Broadway, you'll hear music. Go to 3rd and Lindsley, you'll hear some good music there most nights of the week. But I don't get out much. You know how it is. Okay. Okay, that's it. Those are all the questions. All right. So thanks again for being a part of this, for hanging out with me. If you were here live, for listening on the podcast, watching the video, super glad you're here. And this wraps up this episode of the podcast. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed in YouTube or to my email list, please do so. All the fun stuff happens over there. And other than that, I think we're done. Thanks so much, and see ya on the flip side.